family. I love you guys deeply. I'm sorry.
The house sat still, wrapped in silence. A small, quiet town in Virginia, the kind of place where neighbors nod in passing, where families leave their doors unlocked, where nothing truly shocking ever happens. But inside one home, behind drawn curtains and an unassuming front door, lay a scene so brutal, so incomprehensible, that even the most seasoned investigators would struggle to process it. 4 bodies. Unrecognizable from the sheer force of the attack. A weapon discarded, its purpose fulfilled. And the killer? He hadn't run. He hadn't even tried to hide. For 2 days, he stayed among the dead, living in the aftermath of what he had done. Eating. Sleeping. Using their computers. Replying to messages. As if nothing had changed. The smell of death crept into the walls, thick and inescapable. Flies gathered. The house, once a home filled with love, music, and teenage dreams, had become a tomb. A crime so violent, so personal, that even in a world desensitized to horror, this case would leave an imprint. Richard McCroskey wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a stranger who forced his way in. He was invited. Welcomed. Trusted. And in return, he left a trail of destruction so severe, it would make national headlines. This is the story of an obsession turned deadly. A relationship born in the depths of the internet, nurtured in the shadows of horrorcore music, and destroyed in a single, frenzied act of violence. The Richard McCroskey case isn't just another crime, it's a cautionary tale. A chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Before the murders, before the bloodshed, before the house on First Avenue became a crime scene, there was something else. A world that existed just beneath the surface. A subculture that thrived in the shadows of the internet. A place where the darkest thoughts were turned into lyrics, where violence was glorified, and where those who felt like outsiders finally found a voice. It was called horrorcore. A niche corner of underground hip-hop, horrorcore wasn't about catchy hooks or mainstream appeal. It was darker. Harsher. It spoke of death, mutilation, and rage. Lyrics that detailed graphic murders, dismemberment, and the thrill of destruction. For those drawn to it, horrorcore was more than music, it was an escape. A place where the most disturbing thoughts could be shared without judgment, where the world's misfits found each other. Richard McCroskey was one of them. Online, he was known as Psycho Sam, an aspiring horrorcore rapper who created his own lyrics, violent, gruesome, filled with rage. He wasn't famous, but in certain underground circles, his words reached an audience. An audience that lived in the same darkness he did. His songs spoke of brutality, of revenge, of feeling alone and unwanted. It was fantasy, or so it seemed. But what if it wasn't? In the depths of this online world, he met Emma Niederbrock, a teenage girl from Virginia who shared his love for the genre. To the outside world, Emma was just a regular 16-year-old, bright, outgoing, with a passion for music. But online, she was drawn to the same things Richard was. The two connected instantly, their bond forming through late-night conversations, shared lyrics, and a growing obsession with horrorcore's violent themes. But what McCroskey felt wasn't just friendship. It was more. To him, Emma wasn't just another fan, she was salvation. Someone who saw him, accepted him, understood him. Someone he could belong to. He loved her. Or at least, he thought he did. From thousands of miles away, McCroskey imagined a future with Emma. And for a while, it seemed like she felt the same way. But when love is built on fantasy, reality has a way of tearing it apart. There were signs. Small ones, at first. McCroskey's temper, his insecurity, the way he obsessed over Emma's attention. He wasn't confident. He wasn't charismatic. He was quiet, awkward, deeply withdrawn. And when he felt ignored, he didn't just get sad, he got angry. In his lyrics, in his messages, in the way he spoke about the world, there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Something unstable. Something dangerous. But no one saw it. Not until it was too late. For months, Richard McCroskey had been waiting for this moment. The hours spent online, the messages exchanged, the music that bonded them, it had all led to this. A real-life meeting with Emma Niederbrock. No more screens. No more distance. Just him and the girl he had built his world around. On September 6, 2009, McCroskey boarded a plane from California to Virginia. He was quiet, unremarkable, just another passenger lost in his own thoughts. But beneath his silent demeanor, something was building. Anticipation. Hope. A need for this trip to be everything he had imagined. When he arrived, Emma and her mother, Deborah Kelly, picked him up from the airport. There were no red flags, no immediate signs of trouble. To them, he was just another teenage boy, maybe a little awkward, maybe a little shy, but nothing unusual. But as the days passed, reality began to set in. Emma wasn't as excited as he was. She had liked the idea of Richard more than the person standing in front of her. The messages had been fun, the music had connected them, but now, face to face, something was missing. The spark. The chemistry. The feeling. McCroskey wasn't who she had imagined him to be. Still, they carried on with their plans. On September 12, 2009, Emma McCroskey, her friend Melanie Wells, and Emma's mother set off on a road trip to Detroit, Michigan for a horrorcore festival called Strictly for the Wicked. It should have been a dream come true for McCroskey. A weekend surrounded by the music he loved, with the girl he adored at his side. But something was wrong. Emma was distant. Distracted. More engaged with her friends than with him. The attention he had longed for, the connection he had imagined, it wasn't there. And worse, he could feel it slipping away. There are no records of what exactly happened at that festival. No texts, no messages detailing the moment everything changed. But when McCroskey returned to Virginia with Emma and her family, he was different. Silent. Withdrawn. Something had broken inside him. Over the next few days, the tension grew. Maybe Emma told him outright that she wasn't interested. Maybe she ignored him completely. Maybe he simply knew. What's certain is this: on the night of September 17, 2009, McCroskey had reached his limit. The rejection. The humiliation. The feeling of being cast aside. And this time, he wasn't going to write about it. He was going to act. The house was quiet. Everyone inside had settled in for the night, unaware that their final moments were approaching. Richard McCroskey sat awake, seething. The rejection had cut deep, festering inside him like an open wound. Days of silence, of feeling invisible, of knowing that Emma had never truly wanted him. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was humiliation. And in his mind, there was only one way to make it stop. He reached for the weapon he had chosen, a maul, a tool meant for splitting wood, heavy, brutal, capable of immense destruction with a single swing. Deborah Kelly was the first to die. In the darkness of her bedroom, she never saw him coming. One strike, then another, then another. A frenzy of violence that left her unrecognizable. But he wasn't done. Next was Mark Niederbrock, Emma's father, who had come by to check on his daughter. He barely had time to react before the maul came crashing down. Then, Melanie Wells asleep. Helpless. A single blow crushing her skull before she could scream. And finally, Emma. The girl who had once called him a friend. The girl who had led him to believe there was something between them. The girl who, in his mind, had betrayed him. The attack was swift. Merciless. By the time it was over, the walls were soaked in blood, the house transformed into something unrecognizable. But McCroskey didn't leave. For 2 days he stayed among the dead. He ate their food, used their computers, sent messages from their phones. When people texted, asking where Emma was, he responded as if she were still alive. The smell of decomposition thickened. The reality of what he had done settled in. But he made no effort to clean, no attempt to escape. He just waited. As if he had nowhere else to go. Outside, life carried on. The world remained unaware of what lay inside that house, of the bodies decomposing in silence, of the killer who moved among them as if nothing had happened. But the illusion wouldn't last forever. Friends grew suspicious. Text messages from Emma and Melanie didn't sound right, short, distant, nothing like how they normally spoke. Calls went unanswered. The worry spread. Then came the moment that would unravel it all. On September 18, 2009, Deborah Kelly's colleague, alarmed by her sudden absence, called the police. Officers were sent to do a welfare check. They knocked, waited, heard nothing. From the outside, there were no signs of trouble. But something felt off. A second visit was made the next day. This time, the door was forced open. And the horror inside was revealed. The stench hit them first, thick, sickly, unmistakable. A smell that only meant one thing. As they stepped inside, they were met with a nightmare. Blood-splattered walls. Lifeless bodies in various states of decay. The kind of scene that stays with you long after you've left. McCroskey wasn't there. But he hadn't gone far. Just hours after the bodies were discovered, police found him at Richmond International Airport, waiting for a flight back to California. He sat quietly, making no attempt to run, no effort to hide. The same person who had wielded a maul with unimaginable force now seemed almost indifferent, detached from the reality of what he had done. His arrest was uneventful. No struggle, no resistance. When questioned, he didn't try to deny it. The confession came easily, as if the weight of his actions had already sunk in. Richard McCroskey had nowhere left to go. And now, the world would finally see him for what he was. The trial was never going to be long. There was no mystery, no doubt about what had happened inside that house. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard McCroskey had left his DNA, his fingerprints, his footprints in blood. His confession had been straightforward. There was no argument to be made for innocence. But the question remained, why? Psychologists examined him, looking for answers. Some saw signs of deep-seated rage, abandonment issues, a young man whose reality had collapsed the moment he felt rejected. Others pointed to his horrorcore persona, the violent lyrics he had written, the way he glorified destruction in his music. But none of that could fully explain what had driven him to kill so brutally, to strike again and again until nothing remained of the people he had once called friends. McCroskey never showed emotion in the courtroom. He didn't cry, didn't plead for forgiveness. He sat still, staring down, as if the weight of his crimes had finally settled in. There would be no trial by jury. In 2010, he accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. For life sentences with no chance of parole. A quiet ending for a case that had left an entire town reeling. And just like that, he was gone. Locked away, forgotten by the world outside. But the horror he left behind? That would never fade. The town of Farmville would never be the same. The house where the murders took place, once a home filled with music, laughter, and teenage dreams, had become a place of nightmares. The families left behind were shattered, their grief too heavy for words. A crime so brutal, so senseless, left scars that could never fully heal. For those who had known Emma, Melanie, Deborah, and Mark, there was no making sense of it. A trip meant to celebrate music and friendship had ended in horror. And for what? A wounded ego? A fantasy that had unraveled? The horrorcore community distanced itself from McCroskey. Many argued that the music was just an art form, an outlet, not a blueprint for violence. But outsiders saw it differently. The case reignited debates about violent lyrics, online culture, and the blurred lines between fantasy and reality. In the years that followed, the story faded from headlines, but for those who lived through it, the memories remained. A cautionary tale about trust, obsession, and the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Richard McCroskey sits in prison, his life reduced to a small, confined space. No more horrorcore. No more online personas. Just the weight of what he did, the silence of his own making. But the real tragedy isn't where he ended up. It's the lives he stole. The futures that were erased. The families that still wake up every day knowing their loved ones are never coming home. Some crimes fade with time. This one never will. Even after all these years, certain questions remain. What was Richard McCroskey truly thinking in those final moments before he picked up the maul? Was it pure rage, or had he planned it all along? If Emma had welcomed him the way he had imagined, would any of this have happened? Or was he always destined to kill? Some believe he was a ticking time bomb, waiting for an excuse. Others see a lonely, insecure young man who lost control in a moment of rejection. But no explanation can undo what was done. The internet has changed since 2009. Social media has evolved, online communities have shifted, but the dangers remain. People still form deep, emotional connections through screens. Strangers become friends. Sometimes more. And while most of these relationships never lead to tragedy, stories like this remind us that not everyone online is who they appear to be. The house on First Avenue has long been emptied, but its history lingers. The victims' families have had to rebuild their lives, carrying the weight of what happened. And in a prison cell somewhere, Richard McCroskey lives in the silence he created, far removed from the world he once tried to belong to. This case is a reminder that behind every screen, behind every username, there is a real person. And sometimes, the most dangerous ones are the ones no one ever sees coming. The Richard McCroskey case isn't just a story of murder. It's a warning. If you found this case as chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal the darkest corners of the human mind. Like this video to support our work, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think drove Richard McCroskey to commit such a brutal crime? Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't just in horror stories.